I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake,
I'm Rosie.
and this is our podcast on The Good Life, a BBC sitcom that aired in 4 series and 2 subsequent specials from 1975 to 1978. As I mentioned at the end of the previous release, the sit of the sitcom comes from self-sufficiency in Surbiton. Tom and Barbara Good setting up a kind of small holding in their rather expensive posh house in the Avenue in Surbiton, much to the surprise and in some cases chagrin of the local community. And of course Tom and Barbara's interplay and relationship with the next door neighbours, Jerry and Margot Ledbetter, provides the backbone of the sitcom, and the 4 of them interacting in various ways is really what the show is made up of and why it works. I don't remember really watching The Good Life as a young child. We had a phase of watching repeats of it in the early evening on BBC Two in the late 90s. And really the first one we ever really came across or noticed was the Christmas special, which is actually the penultimate episode of all, as it turns out. Yet it is very striking, funny, and memorable. But I do remember watching those repeats and taking a while to realise what the sit of the sitcom actually was, that Tom and Barbara were attempting to be self-sufficient in Surbiton. And that's why they had all these vegetables growing in the gardens, and they had a goat and pigs and worrying about their allotments and things. And I guess if you do watch a couple of episodes, the penny will drop, even if you know nothing about the show to start with.
I remember some sort of documentary about classic sitcoms, and they were showing these clips of the 4 of them interacting, and they were saying how Margot was the breakout character, and particularly showing the clip of the 4 of them all drunk, and Jerry and Tom and Barbara trying to move Margot's windbreak. There was no explanation why it needed to be moved, because it was going to block the sunlight for Tom and Barbara's soft fruits that they were growing as part of their self-sufficiency. And everyone was saying, oh, Margot was the odd one out, she didn't get the joke, and there's a clip of her saying, please tell me why it's funny. That Christmas episode, do they even mention vegetables and goats and chickens and things? If they do, it's very forgettable. I didn't know why they were having an economical Christmas, free as far as possible.
Yes, I don't think I found it very obvious that it was a self-sufficiency Christmas. As you say, it seems to be an economical Christmas, making the crackers out of the rolls of lavatory paper and so on. But if you're not already familiar with the setup, it's not very revealing. Going back and watching that first episode for the first time with Tom at work, designing his cereal box giveaway hippo at the big plastics company in central London, and being rather disaffected with how his life is going, and coming up with the self-sufficiency plan. Things like the Christmas special all seem to fall into place very nicely. We always say when we're watching it, it would be absolutely impossible to do nowadays. And even like David Banner's lifestyle in the 1970s wouldn't be as easy to do in the 1970s as it appears to be on the telly. Not that it really is easy for Tom and Barbara, but they managed to make it work.
Even in the 70s, you need to be able to have the knowledge and skills to build your own electricity generator out of an effluent digester and whatever else Tom uses. It's shown that he's this very technically able, clever designer. Not many people are that, are they?
Yes, and even with Tom being able to build the generator and so on, so they don't have to pay the electric bill, and selling their surplus to pay the rates and so on, we do point out while watching it, well, they do really need to be spending more money than they're actually making on the rolls of lavatory paper, for example, on the tea they're always drinking. I think even in 1975 that lifestyle would come apart as quickly as Jerry and Margot think it's going to, in a world that is not a BBC sitcom, unfortunately. But it's a rather appealing setup to get emotionally invested in.
Like an awful lot of these BBC sitcoms, it was written by two guys, John Esmond and Bob Larby. Bob Larby is also known for, by me anyway, As Time Goes By, Judi Dench and Jeffrey Palmer getting back together after 38 years. And there are a lot of jokes and situations and one-liners in The Good Life that I've already seen before in As Time Goes By. Quite a lot of which are to do with women being silly and funny, not very funny tradespeople. And those bits in The Good Life I find a bit annoying, and I say, yeah, that's the Bob Larby bit. And the more successful, funnier bits I tend to assume are John Esmond. Continuity errors and things that don't quite make sense I tend to blame Bob Larby for, rightly or wrongly, because those come up in As Time Goes By. For instance, they're always saying the company Jerry works for and Tom worked for makes cereal box toys. Like that's all they make. Really, they make plastics for all kinds of companies. Another thing about their work that doesn't seem quite right is the idea that Tom and Jerry started on the same level in the same job, and Jerry has progressed, working up on the 6th floor directly under Sir, and Tom has not progressed and is still on the 4th floor doing boring old designing. Actually, designing is very important in this industry, and Tom is very, very, very good at it. And Jerry isn't a designer, he's a businessman. He does organising and he does selling and things like that. So the idea that Jerry started where Tom is and Tom could be where Jerry is if he had worked hard and sucked up really doesn't make sense. They're both in the right place.
That women being silly writing really came to a head in an episode called The Last Posh Frock, which we both agreed should be expunged from existence. It's got Barbara being very silly and really out of character. I don't know how much it's down to the writing or how much it's down to the way Felicity Kendall approaches the character, but really Barbara seems to be usually the one who takes to the self-sufficiency, mucking in on everything, making the best of things, mend and make do lifestyle, really rather better than Tom does, uncomplainingly, stoically, and getting a great deal of satisfaction out of it. So seeing her fussing and crying about the last posh frock really does stick out like a sore thumb and rankles quite a lot.
There's nothing prior to that to suggest that she gives a toss about her posh frock, and then even if there was, making her scream and shout and get hysterical and pour gravy on herself would be taking it too far.
I often think how lost Tom would be without Barbara's support, without Barbara's hard graft, really. Sometimes we've remarked how their workload isn't very evenly spread because they both work on the gardens and the allotments, all the new aspects of their self-sufficiency lives, but of course Barbara still does all the housework and the cooking because she's the wife. Tom might occasionally wash up for her, but he tries to duck out of it as much as possible. When Jerry and Margot's daily help go on holiday unexpectedly, and we see Margot's having to do the housework and Jerry's having to do the garden, that's presented as how the work is shared. The lady does all the housework and the man does the gardening. But you can't argue that Tom is doing all the gardening while Barbara's doing all the housework in their normal everyday lives, because their garden is now their working farmland, and they're both doing plenty of physical work out there every day, and Barbara puts in more than her fair share of the graft.
You will occasionally see Tom mending something. Not sewing, that's Barbara, but a tool or something. But that's not every day, is it? It's not even probably every week. One episode in which Barbara gets upset and, for want of a better word, slightly hysterical, is very early on, where they get the range and Tom's got her cleaning it, brushing it, getting all sooty, while he messes about cutting out hawk shapes from cereal boxes, which they still have around the house early on, of course, to try and scare off the birds. It's not just being sooty, being scruffy that's upset her, it's Tom not helping.
I do think Tom has this awful tendency to try and duck out of things like that. And sometimes when they've both been working hard outside, Tom will come in, sit down, and then expect Barbara to give him coffee or whatever. I do think they needed to think more carefully about dividing equally the work to be done inside the house as well as outside to make this venture work. And obviously that hasn't occurred to the writers at any point. And the way Tom Good is as a character really does exacerbate that impression, I think, that he's putting on Barbara an awful lot. Whenever Margot's worrying about Barbara, look what Tom's putting you through, look what he's done to you. And Barbara's always quick to come to his defence. We share everything, Margot, we do half the work each. I always think, well, it's not really true, is it? You really do carry the whole situation, Barbara, and he's more than happy to sit back and let you and do as little as possible himself. And I don't think that's what the writers really intended, but I do find that it comes across that way. I was actually being reminded of the Watership Down cartoon, thinking about how they should divide up the labour around the house more. Tom very much has this attitude of the man does the man's things, but we're in a whole different situation now, like the rabbits on Watership Down have to realise. If we sit around saying bucks don't dig, the does need to dig the warren, well, it's not going to happen, is it? We're all bucks. Except Blackberry, who they turned into a woman. She's not going to dig the warren by herself, is she? We're in a new situation. We need to think in new ways and be prepared to adapt. That's really three things we've talked about at some length on podcasts where that needs to happen and doesn't really. Watership Down cartoon, The Good Life in Tom and Barbara's house, and of course the Thundercats on Third Earth.
Now, having seen this documentary, when I saw the way they did the opening credits, I was surprised. I thought, well, it's a four-way thing, isn't it? Why does it say Richard Dryer's in The Good Life? And then in smaller letters, Felicity Kendall, Penelope Keith, Paul Eddington. And I suppose the reason is that Richard Dryers was the most famous and they thought it was going to be about him and he was going to be getting the most laughs. And we did notice that Barbara hasn't got any kind of backstory or any interests of her own or ever talks about anything or does anything other than to do with this self-sufficiency, which was Tom's idea. And Richard Dryers has his way of acting, of doing his comedy, which combined with this way in which Tom Good is written makes him come across as rather irritating, because sometimes he'll be seeming to try and make a joke out of ducking out of the work, acting bossy and domineering husband and trying to be funny about it. And Felicity Kendall makes you believe in it by laughing, by showing that Barbara likes Tom and enjoys Tom's antics, but you and I were both finding them rather irritating, weren't we?
I think every time I watch The Good Life, I dislike Tom Good more and more. Perhaps the audience is supposed to feel the same way about him as Barbara does. But really, I think it's all thanks to Felicity Kendall that we believe that Barbara loves Tom because of how she reacts to him.
In that Windbreak episode, Tom very much and Barbara a little bit of laughing at Margot, and when she seems to be getting upset, Tom carries on, can't see past his own enjoyment.
And all that sort of humour that he takes too far, kind of teasing other people, their beliefs, their efforts, does come from a very unattractive part of his character. He is very disparaging of other people, even when they're going out of their way to help him. You were pointing it out with Jerry in particular. Tom often takes it out on Jerry. Jerry's trying to help look after the generator, provide the light for the birthing of the piglets. Tom doesn't seem at all grateful. He's very quick-tempered, scornful. I think you'd always feel rather indignant if you tried to help him with something from his reaction, and carrying that over into the kind of joking, teasing way he is still shows a rather bad attitude towards other people. I find I particularly dislike Tom when he steamrollers in with his decisions like, no, we're not doing that, we're not getting sponsorship from the local businesses. Oh, here I am in Dorking, I'm going to spend our £10 that is unallocated on this loom. And he never considers Barbara's feelings or asks for her input first. And then, of course, she'll come in later and explain to him why he's wrong, and he's always like, I'm sorry, love, and they make up. But he never seems to learn from his experiences. And indeed, in those situations, I always do agree with Barbara. about what they can and cannot do within their principles, and what they should and shouldn't spend their unallocated £10 on, even after they've discussed the matter. Of course, they're stuck with the loom anyway, which is one of the very stupid things that gets incorporated into the show. Not as stupid as the road taxed and insurance rotary cultivator with the trolley on the back, which we can't bear to watch and sit there saying, oh, this is absolutely stupid.
Horse and cart is a much better idea.
So much better. Fuel for the generator into the bargain. So really, in many ways, I do feel quite sorry for Barbara. She does manage to convince me that she loves Tom, but I don't necessarily think she's right to do so.
It's interesting that the two writers, John and Bob, inspired themselves with The Good Life to write another sitcom for Richard Briers, Ever Decreasing Circles, which I've never seen, but I understand is about Richard Briers being a bit of a jerk, not getting along with his neighbours, being a bit of an anti-hero. Perhaps that's better suited to his style of acting. He's not a bad actor, he's very good in Watership Down. Evidently, it's quite easy to misuse him, and that's what we agree about The Good Life, but I think overall people do enjoy Richard Briers in it, and they certainly like seeing him being part of the quartet of actors. And they do all have good chemistry with each other, it cannot be denied. Margot really is a bit of a breakout character. You obviously have to have Penelope Keith to play that role. In the first episode, you can tell for some reason she's not available, whether they haven't found her yet or whether she was busy doing something else. You never see her on screen. Some lines are dubbed on her calling to Jerry while he's at the window, demanding to know why Tom and Barbara are dancing around their garden in the middle of the night, having just decided to do their self-sufficiency plan, of course. Very slightly, Margot reminds me of David Horton in The Vicar of Dibley, because she's a little bit of an antagonist at times, not as much as David Horton in the entire first series of The Vicar of Dibley, and mainly in one episode, Tom and Barbara are getting their pigs, and Margot makes them agree to get rid of the pigs when they get into her garden, which of course happens straight away. Building their pigsty right against her fence wasn't a very good idea, was it? But she comes through in the end, and after that, Margot is not so bad, and in the final episode of the first series, where their harvest is all blown over and is going to rot away, and Tom's got a bad back, and Jerry's helping with his foot in plaster, Margot comes along in her big yellow sou'wester and raincoat and Wellington boots and helps Pip, which, when you first get to know her, you would never think that she would do. And of course that underlines the strength of the friendship between the Goods and the Ledbetters. And Penelope Keith is very funny, isn't she? And she's very obviously funny as the extremely snobby, rather clueless, ideas above her station kind of neighbour. The exact opposite of the kind of person you would think it's a good idea to be self-sufficient next door to, and of course that's how comedy works. Contrast, clash of personalities, etc. And if anyone is a bit of a fastidious, high-maintenance neighbour and puts down newspapers so you don't walk on their carpet and things, they might get told, oh, you're Margot out of The Good Life.
I like the bit where Margot is talking to Tom and Barbara about what sort of people she doesn't want moving into the house on the other side of Tom and Barbara. And Tom and Barbara say to her something like, surely we're the biggest blot on the local landscape, Margot. Margot's like, yes, of course, I can't bear your lifestyle and your pigs. And seeing Barbara looking like a tramp the whole time when she should be wearing nice posh dresses. But you're dear friends. And I think that sums it up very nicely. And Jerry says something very similar to Margot in the pig one. I'd much rather have Tom and Barbara as friends with pigs than not friends without pigs. I remember watching that Christmas special for the first time. It was really Margot that was making me laugh, and her character I got the idea of. I mentioned the inside of the roll of lavatory paper. She can't understand how Tom has turned that into a cracker and that there's actually a motto and a hat inside of it. And of course, when she finds the hat, absolutely brilliant reaction, this is the Daily Mirror. Of course, she's not going to interact with the Daily Mirror, even to wear it as a hat. So Tom is left to say, I'm so sorry, Margot, please have the Telegraph, and she'll wear that paper had.
That's a very reasonable little jokey reaction by Tom. If they kept it at that sort of level, or began it at that sort of level, I think then he would be a more successful character and more what they were going for.
Absolutely. Whereas when he says, inside that, when she can't understand about the roll of lavatory paper, that makes me think of him really having a go at people disparagingly in other situations.
Jerry is introduced as a bit of the same sort of thing as Margot, but he's less kind of horrified by it than Margot. He does say at one point something like, well, I'm not going to try and stop you. I think this whole nonsense is going to fizzle out on its own. But then Jerry does very often help them. You've given 2 examples in which Tom gets snippy with him for things that aren't his fault, waiting for someone to come and certify the generator is safe, and it happens to break down, and holding the light for the pigs. And that's a bit I like very much, one of Jerry's deadpan one-liners. Barbara is all excited, saying, "Isn't it wonderful, Jerry?" And he responds, "Yes, I've always wanted to stand in a pigsty in the middle of the night." And that gets a laugh out of me much more than anything poor Richard Briers says in this particular show. And really, I think Paul Eddington is my favourite performer. In fact, that Richard Briers in, and then the 3 of them, is in reverse order of how much I enjoy them. Of course, it's a lot of reacting Paul Eddington does, and his thing that he got off the back of it was Yes Minister, and then later on Yes Prime Minister, which really is him being a kind of posh man in a suit reacting to funny things going on around him. Not forgetting that Penelope Keith also got something off the back of The Good Life, To the Manor Born, which is all about her being posh and snobby and wanting to influence the new, inexperienced Lord of the Manor. Felicity Kendall, I had to look up what work she got next, and it was more of a sort of drama thing about being a divorcee, perhaps inspired by someone thinking, well, she should get rid of Tom and try things on her own.
The bit with Felicity Kendall that I found most striking and funny this time was where she's accidentally offering to pay the window cleaner in kind very early on in the whole proceedings. And of course that window cleaner is one of those rather unfunny tradesmen that you mentioned. But the way Felicity Kendall performs that is very funny, and it's very clear from what she's saying and how she's saying it why the window cleaner thinks she's offering to go to bed with him as payment for the windows, and why she doesn't think she is. She treads a very fine line there of sounding suggestive but not really meaning to.
Another thing about that scene is that we always say, well, you should get rid of that window cleaner. You don't need window cleaning. It's not an essential, and it's not worth some of your capital.
It's very good for them, really, when they make friends with the man who was stealing their leeks, because he's a painter and decorator, so if he's going to come round and sort out their kitchen ceiling and things in exchange for vegetables, that works really well.
Not the least of why it would be different nowadays is that you wouldn't plant vegetables all over your front garden without any kind of fence and not expect people to steal them. On these documentaries, they love telling the story about the location manager driving around looking for 2 houses next door to each other, one very posh looking and the other a bit tatty, and people inside probably won't mind the BBC coming and saying, can we dig up both your gardens and fill them up with chickens and things? And actually, I think that location manager did very well, because Margot and Jerry's house has this big sweeping drive instead of any kind of front lawn at all, which speaks for their different lifestyles.
Talking about the window cleaner reminds me of what I was saying about you definitely couldn't manage money in the way they do now, and you probably couldn't in the 70s. I think it's fine to pay for your kitchen ceiling to be painted and your window cleaner if you're having him with vegetables. But I think going into the newsagents and swapping 2 eggs for a newspaper wouldn't really work even in the 70s. You can't really use them as general currency in a place of business.
It's a fantasy, isn't it? I think that's what a lot of people like about it. They like to watch it and imagine it could be real, like a Disney movie or something.
That reminds me of how I wanted to mention that one of the things that made Come Dine With Me completely unwatchable was when, if one of the contestants had the slightest thing like a chicken in the garden or had grown a couple of carrots, they'd start sticking the Good Life theme all over it, and that would annoy us no end.
It did seem to happen a lot on Come Dine With Me, and perhaps in a time when it was fashionable to have a chicken in your garden. But it does speak for the popularity and the endurance of The Good Life, and how it's in the soup that you recognise the tune and you associate it with chickens in the garden.
It's one of those things where the second season struggled a bit.
I think the episode in series one, where Tom accepts freelance work so they can go off and have a hotel break, is unnecessary. One 6 episode series really would have done it.
It always annoys us how they've had to go back on Barbara's found a wholesaler for their surplus. Oh no, now we have to sell this surplus. We can't sell this surplus or not for enough money. It made absolute perfect sense in season one. You need to sell it to a wholesaler, not to a restaurant or illegally on the street. And that's what they would have done, should have done. But they had to back up on that to make more episodes.
It was out of character, really, to suggest that they hadn't researched and found out what they would need to do. Series 2, I think, is overall a bit forced, trying to get comedy out of Jerry and Sir playing golf while Tom's going around with this shotgun, which I don't believe he has a license for, saying he's going to shoot the rabbits, to reintroduce that self-sufficiency situation and reintroduce, look at Richard Bryars, isn't he funny? Series 2 has the episode with the sort of hippie students coming and doing a bit of work and being in awe of Tom and Barbara. Got Bob Larby written all over it and is not particularly successful, I don't think.
I always think it would be a good idea, as a way of making use of their resources, to have a lodger of some kind, not necessarily students who are interested in the lifestyle. Tom's philosophy is not being trapped into working for someone else. If you have a lodger in the house, paying you to live there, so you can buy things like clothes and tea and lavatory paper and sanitary towels, it's making use of your resources, in this case the living quarters of the property you own, as well as the land out front and back that you can cultivate.
There's also the episode where they're almost talked into buying a small holding, and there's this theme of practicality, and it's so much more practical to have this much land. What practical reason is there for us not to buy this small holding? Well, I can think of two. One is that they haven't got any capital besides their house, which I don't believe would be enough to sell and buy this so many acres of land. Another one is that they've already dug up their front and back garden and got their allotments and got all their crops established.
That episode is one of the ones where I do strongly dislike Tom. He does steamroller in with making the decision about buying this small holding, and then he wants to make himself look emotionally stronger than Barbara by not mentioning that he doesn't really want to move either, emotionally manipulating her. If you want to stay, this is where we're going to stay. Again, it's supposed to be kind of a joke, and I don't think we're meant to dislike Tom or think he's morally reprehensible because of it, but I do. But then season 3 we like rather more, don't we?
It's got that windbreak episode, which has got more to do with the relationships and Margot being the odd one out than it has to do with self-sufficiency, although there is that link, the shadow over their fruits.
Now there's a bit of new plot that makes sense, trying to branch out, diversify into the soft fruits so they can get a more saleable, profitable surplus that they'll need after the experience of the first year. Tom and Barbara are experimenting with getting up and going to bed with the sun, using all the available daylight, and it not really working out. It's quite an interesting idea. The pigs are born in series 3. and the inevitable talk to the plants to try and help them grow episode is a decent way to do something new and interesting with an episode of The Good Life. Although Series 3 does have its weaker episodes, I didn't really like the idea of Tom and Barbara taking over for Mr. and Mrs. Pearson to clean and garden for Margot and Jerry. That's so they can tax their stupid rotary cultivator vehicle. I just don't believe they've got the time to do that. The Fleas episode is okay, but it's not a particular highlight. And then, of course, what's the final episode of Series 3?
The Last Posh Frock, which should be expunged from existence. Then Series 4 drops off quite a lot, I think, and has less and less relevance to self-sufficiency. Things like Barbara giving talks, Margot going off and Tom and Barbara thinking, gosh, is she having an affair? And it turns out to be Weight Watchers. And that blinking loom, that's another thing that I think doesn't make enough sense. They haven't got time to weave their own cloth. I suppose they do it in the winter when there isn't much daylight, to collect enough nettles to make sufficient dye to dye the cloth, to make the clothes. Tom spent that £10 on it, as you said earlier. You also said at the time they'd do better to spend that £10 on new clothes. Another irritating thing is that one or both of the writers don't understand how a loom works. They think that you make clothes on the loom, and that's why when you give Margot and Jerry their Christmas jumpers, they're all the wrong size and unravelly and stuff. But that isn't what you do. You weave cloth on the loom, and then you need to get your scissors and your needle and thread to tailor something. And they're never going to find enough wool just lying around.
Then you get towards the end of the series and you're getting the oil leaking over the garden and so on. And we say to each other, Tom and Barbara really do have to have a lot of bad luck for the sitcom to be sustainable. And the audience laughs when Tom contaminates the milk and the fork breaks and the garden's full of oil and things like that. But really, it's actually deadly serious for the goods, and they can ill afford that sort of thing to be going on. Really, the Christmas special is a high peak after a long trough, injecting a bit of Christmas into the situation, seeing how Margot reacts to not being able to get Christmas delivered after her Christmas tree is slightly too short, and how Margot and Jerry joining in with Tom and Barbara's self-sufficiency Christmas builds on their existing relationship as a foursome and also adds something new to it. All works very well indeed. I don't really like the final episode, the Royal Command performance. Tom does come up with the idea of equity release from your house.
One of these things that turn out to be prophetic. That's probably the most interesting thing about it.
But the stuff with the fitness rivalry is all very stupid.
They think Jerry running in a proper expensive-looking tracksuit and Tom running in a string vest and a tatty old pair of shorts is funny. I don't think that's very funny, partly because this contrast between Jerry and Tom isn't as successful as the contrast between Margot and all the rest.
Really, as we've mentioned several times, the chemistry and relationships interplay between the central foursome is at the heart of the show and is what makes it work. They mention the concept of wife swapping a few times. It's made it as far as Isha. Someday it'll come out for Surbiton. I used to say they get quite close to wife swapping at times. But really, I think even when drunk, the only one who's not at all tempted by the idea is Barbara.
Another one of those one-liners by Paul Eddington I like. Barbara saying, I'm a married woman, and Jerry saying, well, so am I. And of course he's the one who suggests moving the windbreak. Let's move it now.
So there we are. Plenty of thoughts on The Good Life, a sitcom we do enjoy and do like to pick several holes in when we watch it, and whose central foursome really does manage to make it work. If you join us again on the final Sunday in April, you'll hear us discussing a franchise with varied and diverse outings on TV and film, namely
The Muppets.
Until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.